with the 2014 release of Environment 5, advertised and marketed as the first proper FSOL new album in almost 20 years, one might expect that things were getting somewhat back to normal. Perhaps the future would hold another series of new albums and singles. This, of course, wasn't the case, and Brian Dougans and Cobain continued their career by following their own rules, with some very unconventional releases. And we'll be looking at those this week on Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. And this week we start with The Future Sound of London, Archived 8, release date 11th September 2015. For a few years, the environments from the Archive series felt linked, not only in terms of release date, put out together or a few months apart, but thematically. Environments from the Archives 4, both featuring versions of Wookiee, Environments 2 and Volume 5 featuring linked tracks and 1997 material, Environments 3 and from the Archives 6 being structurally similar, both with second halves based around short snippets of tracks, and Environments 4 and from the Archives 7 having similarly desert-like atmospheres, and a track from the latter originally being planned for the former. Things could not be further from the truth with Environment 5 and Archived 8. Whereas the former is exceptionally organic, amorphous adjacent at times with heaps of live instrumentation and rich production, Archived 8 feels like a totally unheard FSOL sound for the most part. The only real link they have is in breaking up the album title patterns. After 7 albums of From the Archives volume, the shift to Archived 8? Really? Well, an 8th volume was pretty much expected at this point. The first official confirmation came with Electric Brainstorm 10 in late 2014. The possibility of release had been hinted at by Brian earlier in the year. It was almost a full year until further news came over, with a pre-order added to FSOL Digital out of the blue on 28th August 2015, with cover, tracklist, a description and promise of a 3-track bonus download EP with all FSOL Digital purchases. A poster of the album cover was also available to pre-order at the time. There was some excitement about it being the first archive release to come out as a standalone vinyl album. In typical FSOL style, the first track promoted via YouTube was Bring from the bonus EP rather than the album itself, featuring an animation of the geometric shapes from the album's cover. 5 days later, the first actual album track, Crawler, was previewed with another geometric video, this time with monochrome shapes. The final track previewed, Blue Green, came along 5 days later, with a less abstract video showing the sun reflecting on water. Daz spoke about that track at length on Facebook, more on that in a few minutes, which was once again a great moment for those of us who'd been through the time when he seemed to have lost all interest in FSOL. Initial reactions to the album were mixed, largely because of the very distinct change of style. After the dusty slow breakbeats and piano melodies of the previous volume, Archived 8 is darker, more minimal, very electronic, glitchy and techno and IDM oriented. Truthfully, most tracks sound very little like any FSOL up to this point. Sometimes I look back over my old Amazon reviews of their albums, and on this one I seem to have summed up the album in far better terms than I could today. This is not the FSOL of life forms at one with nature. This is the band still playing with their roots, for tracks that were too rigid, too minimal, too harsh and too bleak to fit on albums like ISDN and even on Dead Cities. At first, it's quite jarring to hear tracks led by robotic drum machines and sharp triangular bass lines, the group's usual lushness pushed right back to distant pads, reverberating in the background. After a few listens, however, the album reveals its intentions. This is indeed brutalist music, making its point in short, blunt blocks of sound. Archived 8 could well be FSOL's most difficult album yet. The album is an alternate history of the group, one where they followed the cold, minimal rhythmic path of IDM and techno instead of creating the lush psychedelic sound collages they're most well known for. A few tracks were already familiar from the YouTube videos: Electric Brainstorm 10, Their Fears and Fantasies of the Unconscious Mind, and in one case, Kiss FM Test Transmission number 2. If the tracks on the previous volume were largely hard to date, then these take that to a new level, largely by not sounding like any particular era of the band's past. The line is blurred even further by the fact that many tracks on the album don't exist in their original form. In some cases, these are completed but unreleased songs from that time. In others, these songs have been reconstructed or enhanced and then further mixed to form the journey, according to FSOL Digital. In some cases these are subtle changes, but in others the pieces are developed from tiny demos. With the Environment series now based around entirely new material, the Archive series has taken its place with an album that is, in its creation at least, as much of a new album as Environments 2 was 7 years before. It's also quite possible that at least some of the material is from the FSOL digital era, with long exposure first included on the Fears and Fantasies of the Unconscious Mind as an Environment 5 track. One thing the album does, unusually, is include gaps between tracks. The one between Unfurl and Still Motion makes some sense placed at the side flip point of the LP, but there are a couple more on the first side. Having finally reached a point with 5 gapless FSOL albums in a row, it was clearly time to mix things up again. In terms of the artwork, the style is once again new and incredibly fitting with the music. The brutalist architecture with hexagons in bold primary and secondary colours both feel strange in contrast with the Vit, shiny and spiky focus covers of the previous volumes. The band name is in the now usual mixed case Eurostyle extended, while all other text is in the similar but slightly different font as seen on the Environment 5 cover and LP spine. The spine is once again in standard Eurostyle. The CD booklet has a range of similarly striking pictures, albeit with less in the way of sharp lines, a shot of Vit and Yage with what is labelled a time machine, the familiar splatter water damage effect over the top, a gorgeous photo of a lake. The centre features a photograph of a temple with some angular polygons heavily reminiscent of Buggy's Jumpin' and Pumpin' era designs, a monochrome picture of what might be a junkyard with track titled Spatial Freak and long exposure pointing to a tower, and the water damage effect once again, a deep concrete water channel with the same effect. All of the photographs have very bold, oversaturated colour layers over them, making them vibrant and somewhat surreal. Underneath the CD is a shot of a line of trees in the mist. The back cover features a continuation of the front's brutalist imagery. It also features roughly the same layout as Environment 5's back cover, with everything left aligned, though it does at least include logos. The EBV logo sits alongside a bar with 3 tiny logos, Herd Killing, EBV and the curve design first seen the previous year in the Artworks 1 booklet. These are found in much larger format on the CD and LP labels, alongside the exploding head logo appearing for the first time without the FSOLdigital.com text below. Interestingly, the rear of the LP has all text in white, contrasting with the black text of the CD edition. For me, Archived 8 is another excellent entry to the From the Archive series, a series which started out with random albums that gradually developed into what sounds like a consistent and unique 90s FSOL album in its own right by the 7th volume. After this, it makes sense that a What If style album would come along that posits a totally different type of FSOL record made from a lot of the same material. It also acts as an aesthetic change from the increasingly acoustic sounding FSOL of the first half of the 2010s. It remains a divisive album to this day, and those looking for classic sounding FSOL should look elsewhere, specifically Volume 7 if they haven't already heard it, but as a totally new experience it's excellent. Although it wasn't a conscious attempt to make the album this kind of alternate history, the curation of the record began with Crawler, which Brian believes dictated the style and flow, hence this new direction. The FSOL Digital exclusive bonus EP artwork features a couple of images in keeping with the CD booklet, as well as the new run of logos. Musically, the 3 tracks, all linked, provide a similar experience to the bonus EPs packaged with Environment 5 and Artworks 1, miniature slices of FSOL that could easily have been taken from a longer album. All 3 play gaplessly and are hard to date. 10 lucky fans are also the owners of a test pressing, with signed copies sold in a bundle alongside the main LP album. Sorrow. First heard on Electric Brainstorms Volume 6 with the strings played over Phil Polsky's Lies About Vietnam poem, and then later expanded to include the full track of that poem in Electric Brainstorm 10, Sorrow had been active for quite a while before appearing on Archived 8. Not that it's easy to identify a particular era of the track, the fast complex beats don't really sound like Jumpin' and Pumpin' era, but also feel too dancey for a later track. The synth melodies fit the title brilliantly, as this is a very bleak, melancholic sounding track, with the string sample adding an eerie touch. It is very possible that elements of it date back to the 90s and it was dramatically reworked for the album. The final 40 seconds move into an outro environment with synth bleeps, clicks, scrapes and pops, and other unsettling sounds. Acturum S. The double bass loop, cello and flute notes and typical 90s FSOL sample layers of Acturum S make it feel somewhat like a track from the Archives Volume 7, but the beats are much more mechanical sounding, not at all what one would expect from such a track. A few familiar sounds are used, including synth sweeps from Lifeform Ends and birdsong from Bird Wings, making it likely to be a Lifeforms era piece. Indeed, the amount of organic sounding samples, flutes and warm synth pads point to those sessions in their own right. However, the odd beats suggest this might have been a more recently updated track. Nocturnal insects and helicopters shimmer quietly in the background for the closing environment and fade out to near silence, with maybe only half a second cross-fading into the next track. Blue Green. Blue Green was one of the tracks previewed on YouTube to promote Archived 8, and shortly afterwards Gaz spoke at length about the track on Facebook. After so many years of him only really discussing Amorphous, these rare occasions where he'd talk about FSOL so openly and enthusiastically were always a joy. I'll read the whole post for you here. "I've unearthed a beauty," Brian exclaimed down the phone one afternoon in May. I'd become accustomed to hearing such things over the years. Of course, Brian had taken on the custodianship of all the DATs and master recordings of FSOL's 90s period, the janitor as he was known, and thus the janitor was always searching for FSOL bounty for the archive releases that had ensued, so yes, it was a common occurrence. Nonetheless, it was, always is, a pleasure to hear such an exaltation. Maybe I could finally retire with this latest find. Hopefully it will be a real treasure. The excitement was palpable, Brian knew it, making me hold on before playing it. The idea that there is magic in the vaults is an enticing one. This afternoon was no different. I was struggling with a new track, perplexed by it, feeling like giving up, so to hear that there was something magic that I'd been involved with at some point in my life was soothing. Would I remember it? Would I be disappointed? Would I be the person to burst the bubble by realising it actually wasn't our track at all, but actually someone else's that had slipped erroneously onto the DAT? It has happened, believe me. I sat back to listen as the first bars of music began to play down the phone line. What I love about the Archive series is it's like being reconnected with oneself. This track was no different. I couldn't remember anything about it. I strained to penetrate the fog of memory. I supplanted memory of two guys in their 20s into that room, Earthbeat, an imaginary argument about the direction of the song, a pivotal breakthrough when one of us took over from the other. But no, I was merely projecting into a void. There was nothing. Most tracks I retained a very keen knowing of who did what and when and how, but tracks we saw no future in, we moved on from tirelessly, and there were literally hundreds of such tracks. Having a major label deal meant that tracks really had to have something really special beyond fast food, and we worked bloody hard to arrive at such fruits in an attempt to make great albums. Tracks done in an hour here or a day there 20 years ago meant that memory really had no chance to consolidate itself, unlike the tracks that actually made it onto the albums. Their quiet, instant prevailing mythology. Yeah, this one was familiar. No, I didn't know it at all, but the essence, the melodies, the directive of what it was trying to say is such a familiar part of Brian and I from that time that it returns home, returns me to home, and it's a lovely feeling. Brian found it on a DAT dedicated to the We Have Explosive single. Part 4 of that had been the ambient foray, so it's probably deemed that this wasn't suitable, and I can see why, but I'm glad to hear it today, and the nostalgia isn't nostalgia at all, it's just part of me that doesn't die, and these archives give me an opportunity to step outside, lose memory and then reacquaint momentarily and quite poignantly with myself as if for the first time, and I'm an old dear friend, or those men in black have zapped my memory, meaning I can enjoy the music I make without actually experiencing the agonising pain of making it. So dear friend, bring me home, and if anyone knows who actually wrote it, then kindly get in touch and we'll sort you out. Lovely post. Okay, so the ambient foray of We Have Explosive was actually part 5, but who's counting? Other than me. Either way, the reveal that this light breezy track came from those sessions was initially quite a surprise. It doesn't really sound like We Have Explosive in the slightest. That is, until one compares it with part 3. And then suddenly it makes sense. The melody's very similar, they're bright, almost Garry synth stabs, the bouncy drum beat. It's totally possible to hear this as an early version of part 3 that developed to become that wonderful and strange instrumental funk track on the single. A lot of the rhythmic elements of that started in a very different piece, including We Have Explosive vocal samples, so it's quite possible that that piece and Blue Green had been merged at some point to create the final track. There are 2 melodic lines in the piece, which both play through twice, the rhythm track becoming gradually more complex, and then after a couple of minutes some huge slams come in and end the main track, leading to a brief outro environment of synth gurgles and a flute note, and then silence. Brian remembers it being originally a Gaz composition. Crawler. Crawler begins with the flute note from Blue Green's closing environment, making the 2 tracks musically linked even if there is a second of silence between the 2. The title is fitting with an insectile, skittering beat, angular synth bass, unsettling drones and layers of creeping, writhing samples. Distant droning melodies come and go, equally as eerie. It's a pretty minimal piece, simply building up and then disappearing into the fog again, but it creates an incredibly effective atmosphere. Muffled synths and percussion form a claustrophobic outer environment. Forlorn. After the thoroughly sinister Crawler, Forlorn is a welcome moment of brightness. Comparatively at least, it's still very much in a minor key, but the guitar melodies and chirping beats are more evocative of open nocturnal spaces. It's a very difficult piece to place, with the clicking rhythms and sampled and sequenced acoustic guitar screaming dead cities, but the phase strings are reminiscent of Snake Hips, while the vocal sample dates back to the 3D Headspace tour or earlier. It's quite possibly a track that was pieced together from numerous archive sketches, or even an example of the eras overlapping. Further samples are added as beats near the end, with synth arpeggios bringing the very pretty track to a climax. The final 40-second environment comes in the form of a completely unrelated arpeggio, which is a bit jarring at first. The track eventually fades out to silence. Halloy Slope. More Dead Cities-esque beats here, the high-pitched squeak being reminiscent of the unreleased LA4 and slowly falling backwards, but otherwise a track that once again doesn't sound quite like anything else from the group's 90s period. Instead of samples used to play melodies or even looped and thrown in, the harmonic content of the piece instead comes from soft, gentle synth pads gradually morphing and swirling around over the whole track. A few samples added in the second half bring a more familiar FSOL sound to proceedings. Once again, it's possible that this piece started out as little more than a rhythmic sketch and was completed in 2015. Little change, but an enjoyable atmosphere, which eventually fades out to a quiet drone. Unfurl. First heard on Electric Brainstorm 10 in longer form, Unfurl is Archive 8's first ambient piece and feels almost like an environment rather than a full track. It opens with warm, friendly acoustic guitar chords and a distant bird call before warm synths and piano come in. The piano notes sound direct from Environments 4, suggesting there's definitely some modern work here. The track could even be a leftover from that album, as its rustic acoustic vibe is very in line with it, although the layers of harsher sounding synth drones over the second half keep it anchored to the brutalist sound of Archive 8. The piece fades to silence and ends side 1 of the LP edition. Still Motion. An unusual one this. The general response to the lo-fi 808 beat with its almost trap-like hi-hat rolls was one of surprise on first listen. Brian later elaborated on the piece. The beat was sitting around on a DAT tape from '95, obviously some loose experiment back then. I grabbed it and added some synth bits that were also hanging. Married the two and added some bass, half modern but lingers in the distant past. Even though it sounds nothing like 90s FSOL, nor any FSOL releases at this point in the FSOL digital era, it's a combination of the two eras. The minor key synths and catchy bass line continue the euphoric sadness feel of the album, while the drum line gradually increases in complexity, with scraping samples and eventually Dead Cities-esque IDM programming bringing the track to a head. For all its uncharacteristic nature, or possibly because of it, it's been one of the most popular tracks on the album since it came out. Chopped up voices and the frequently used Frogs field recording act as a closing environment, with the piece ending on some very familiar water sounds. Plasmatical. After a run of subtly complex pieces, Plasmatical is a bit of a slap on the face with the early 90s. The track was first heard on Kiss FM Test Transmission 2 in late 1992, announced as a new Yage track called Plasma. Bouncy synth melodies, 4-4 techno beats, 3/3 squelches, modulated arpeggios, it's all very much of its time, but it's a pretty fun track nevertheless. Remarkable to think that this was recorded at the same time the band had begun work on Tales of Ephedrina and Lifeforms. Once again, this alternate history aspect of Archive 8 comes into play, with the possibility of this being what their second album could have sounded like had they not gone down the sample-based ambient route. Not to be confused with the Archive 4 track, Plasmatic. Spatial Freak. Not to be confused with Spatial Freak Out, the working title for Quagmire on the 1995 Peel session. Spatial Freak is in fact another earlier piece, most likely from '92 again, and one that follows on so smoothly from Plasmatical that I used to think they were the same track when first listening to the album without checking the tracklist. Spatial Freak feels a touch more developed, with some of the band's characteristic textural samples scattered over the piece, a staggered kick drum and more subtle synth melodies, but it's still very much rooted in the band's earlier dance music influences. Metallic shimmers and synth drones form a brief outer environment. Long Exposure. After a couple of early 90s tracks, Archive 8 makes a move forward a long way with a piece which is probably from the 2010s, being an Environment 5 outtake announced in 2012 on The Fears and Fantasies in the Unconscious Mind, as being from that album under the title 7 Asterisks. It's understandable why it was later omitted from that record. Its almost aggressive rhythm track would make it very out of place. The drums sound very much like gunshots, of which an analogue synth drone and plinky melody play. Certainly shares the sadness of Environment 5 though, but it is generally a lot more electronic in feel. It's a beautiful track and a very welcome addition to Archived 8. The closing environment features quiet birdsong. Standing Room. Another one of those pieces that's very hard to place. It's of the same family of tracks as Glacier Part 1 and 2, Fibrillation and Plough with these same flutes and general acoustic sound, but the mangled jazzy drums and epic strings don't really tie it in with any obvious FSOL era. Guitars and growling electric bass add further confusion. The release it sounds closest to is Environments 4 due to its large amount of live instrumentation, suggesting it could be one of the pieces from the album that was developed from older sketches. Either way, it's a bizarre and unique piece, and a very memorable way to close Archived 8, admittedly in a more traditionally FSOL style. The final 90 seconds feature a surreal outer environment with a hypnotic synth loop, chopped up speech samples, and 30 seconds of gradually fading birdsong. Bring. The opening track to Archived 8's bonus EP is especially unusual in that it doesn't really sound like anything else in the FSOL catalogue. Dark piano melodies, breathy vocal samples, discordant strings, a lot of weird background samples, leading into a section with lo-fi drum machine rhythms and synth cello. The sound design is as deep and complex as the band's 90s work, but the actual instrumentation feels more like an Environments era piece. It might have been developed from MIDI files from an older track rather than actual sounds, but if it had been released with no context, I doubt anyone would have suggested it was an archive track. Compounding confusion further, it was expanded upon dramatically for its inclusion on Life in Moments later in the year, a track so different that it deserves its own discussion. C and LSD, also known as C and LCD. Recorded on location in Troon, Ayrshire, according to the ID tag of the Archived 8 bonus EP MP3, this field recording of the seaside, gulls, waves and all, is overlaid with beautiful synth chords. Despite that description, it's nowhere near new age music, with odd reverbs creating a strange soundscape and darker chords coming in closer to the end. For its inclusion on Life in Moments, the first 54 seconds were removed. I'm going to call it Grinder Tone, because I do not know how to pronounce the Greek. The only track on the Archived 8 bonus EP to actually sound like a 90s track, the fast booming drums here feel like something from the group's Virgin years, although it's very hard to put a place on them. The synths, however, feel more modern, with comparatively little in the way of the group's usual sampling. Another half-finished track updated in the 2010s, perhaps? For its inclusion on Life in Moments, the Greek title, meaning grindstone, is translated to the similar but meaningless grinder tone. The Future Sound of London Mushroom 11 soundtrack. Release date 15th October 2015. The computer game Mushroom 11 was first announced in March 2014 at the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, with the news that the soundtrack would be by FSOL. A preview video had in fact gone up a couple of weeks before, featuring Field of Flowers as its soundtrack. Itek Heron, the game's developer, wrote about his love of the band and his joy in working with them on his blog later in the month. I've been a huge fan of British electronic music duo The Future Sound of London, FSOL, since the 90s. Their experiments in various musical subgenres have inspired me for decades, with masterpieces like ISDN, Dead Cities, and my personal favourite, Lifeforms. When coming up with the original designs for Mushroom 11, I used to listen to FSOL while designing its dark, desolate world. The pace, story, and even the mechanics were highly influenced by their unique ambience. Around a year ago, I decided to try and get FSOL on board with the production of Mushroom 11. I believed it would be a near impossible task for me, an indie developer with no PR or funds, nor with a compelling product at the time, to convince this supergroup to join forces. I was thoroughly surprised at how helpful and accommodating they were, and how much they believed in the game, even when all I had to show for it was interesting mechanics, programmer art, and some grandiose ideas. They provided me with tips, ideas, and a huge selection of beautiful, electrifying music, which really helped me define Mushroom 11 and set its style and direction. So I couldn't be prouder to announce the collaboration between Mushroom 11 and the future sound of London. For a band who often gain the reputation of being aloof and even arrogant, it's amazing just how many stories there are of them being utterly lovely. Speaking of the game's developer at the PAX East Video Game Expo in April 2014, Everswell board member Tim Dwyer, aka Musician Offland, spoke to E-Day, who explained that the original plan was to try and license the whole of Lifeforms. Obviously this was impossible with EMI owning the album and they would have demanded high fees, but the band offered a large selection of archives and environments pieces for him to choose from. Initially the band were unsure, but having had the game and its unique design and concepts pitched, they got on board. A pre-order for the game went up on 12th November with an option to buy a bundle including the game and its soundtrack. The tracklist at this time simply included edits of 11 archives and environments tracks and was thus of relatively little interest to fans as a standalone soundtrack. And then a year later the final full game was launched with a soundtrack featuring the 11 known pieces and 4 exclusive previously unreleased tracks. Sadly it's only available to purchase alongside or after the actual game. As the game is pretty excellent, it's not the worst deal in the world. A mobile edition of the game eventually followed in 2017, winning awards from both Google Play and Apple. The 11 previously heard tracks, edited by Power Up Audio, featured in the game are Field of Flowers, A Corner, North Arctic, River Delta, Summer's Dream, Plough, Environments 1, A Glitch in Cellular Memory, The Empty Land, and End of the World. Wavestat. A very playful short piece, Waystat is based around music box-like bells and bubbling bass. Almost certainly a 2000s era piece, its joyous nature and childlike instrumentation make it sound nothing like any other FSOL track. It's only a brief piece, looping over a few times, but an interesting direction. TX81Z, Another Brother. Another oddity from the Mushroom 11 soundtrack, this strangely titled piece features a darkly playful harp melody, lo-fi hi-hats, a quiet fall-to-the-floor kick, moody synth drones, and a grainy bass riff. It feels more like a sketch than a full piece, and as with Wavestat, doesn't really sound like anything else put out by FSOL or any aliases. The equivalents. The Mushroom 11 exclusives continue on their surprising path with, unexpectedly, a piece that was originally developed for the Shh movie soundtrack. While the band's work for that 2010's film never properly saw the light of day, with the movie stuck in development hell and eventually scrapped, a couple of pieces have been heard since, this being the first. A lively piece with complex breakbeats, layers of arpeggios, fuzzy bass and a gorgeous synth melody is both upbeat and wistful in feel. It doesn't feel like it particularly belongs to any era of the band, with the coming and going structure of their 90s work, the complexity of their Virgin era, the synths and beats vibe of the Passion Music era and the general melancholic atmospherics and polish of the FSOL digital era. It really is a cracking track though, and one that will be sadly heard by relatively few fans. Definitely worth tracking down. The End of the World string version. Dan Pemberton's strings from the intro to The End of the World. Remarkably, this was first heard on A Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble Exploding in Your Mind Volume 3 back in 2002 as a Pemberton piece called Catastrophe, before being absorbed into the Environments 3 track 8 years later. Given its origins, it's probably the only track released as FSOL to feature neither Brian nor Gaz on it. Still, it's a beautiful piece and it makes me wish it had continued further into The End of the World, instead of fading out so soon, given that it is much longer than the intro part to that track. Maybe I'll do my own extended strings edit one day. Given its original appearance in 2002, it's quite possible it was originally recorded for the Amorphous Androgynous. And that's your lot for this week. I do hope you enjoyed the video. Do drop me a line down below, let me know what you think of the video and the music and whatever else you want to chat about related to this. There's also like, subscribe, share, all the usual buttons. Do give one of them a press, it always helps my channel and the video. And I'll be back very soon looking at the band's first full-length published book and its bonus album. Hopefully next week, so do join me then. There are two melodic lines in the piece, both metallic shimmers and synth drones form a metallic shimmers and synth drones form metallic shimmers and synth drones form a brief outer environment. Why was that so hard to say?